about all kinds of stuff. Professor Dave explains.
After the 16 Maha Janapadas of the 6th to 4th centuries BCE were briefly replaced by the Nanda Empire, a new state was founded by Chandragupta Maurya, a young military commander who was guided and advised by a Brahmin philosopher and scholar named Chanakya. This state, which was the first to encompass almost all of the Indian subcontinent and stretched from Afghanistan in the west to Bangladesh in the east, was founded in the late 4th century BCE, in the years just after the death of Alexander the Great. Our information about it comes not only from the Indian religious literature of the time and from the archaeological record, but for the first time also from contemporary Greek accounts. There are also dramatized versions of the series of events that led these two men to found their empire, including a popular play written hundreds of years after the fact, but these may not have any basis in fact. So while our sources agree that it was Chanakya's idea to overthrow the Nanda kings, they offer different explanations as to why. Some thought that he was seeking vengeance for a personal slight from the king, while others thought that he may have felt, as a member of the Brahmin class, that the Nandas, who are said to have come from a humble family, should be replaced with Chandragupta, who had royal blood. In any case, Chandragupta began around 321 BCE by conquering the Nanda's capital of Patna in the Janapada of Magadha, which was the center of their empire. He then defeated the 4 satrapies of northwestern India, which Alexander had set up in 325 when he conquered Gandhara and the other Janapadas of the Indus Valley. He then left control of these regions to some of his Macedonian generals. This part of the story is relayed by Megasthenes, a Greek writer who served for a time as an ambassador to Chandragupta's court. Though his book, called the Indica, no longer exists, he was quoted by later classical authors who refer to Chandragupta as Sandrokotos. After Alexander's death in 323 BCE, his generals fought for control of his territory, and in 312, one of them, named Seleucus, founded an empire that spanned Asia Minor, Mesopotamia, and Central Asia. In 305, Seleucus attempted to recover for his new kingdom the territories Chandragupta had taken from Alexander's satraps. The resulting battle seems to have gone badly for Seleucus because the treaty that he signed with Chandragupta in 303 left the Indian king with all of the territories he had wanted to annex, plus additional areas in northern India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. All of these became part of the expanding Mauryan Empire, whose capital was Patna, and a dynastic marriage was arranged between the two courts. Seleucus also received 500 elephants, which he used in his war with Alexander's other successors. Chandragupta ruled until 297, when he adopted the life of a Jain ascetic and ended his life a few years later by fasting to death in accordance with a Jain practice. Accounts of Chandragupta's government emphasize that Chanakya, who guided him in his policies, taught him to rule according to the principles of dharma, or proper order. Chanakya himself was the author of a book called Arthashastra, meaning the science of prosperity, in which he laid out the principles of good government, political strategy, and economic policy. Given Chanakya's importance as the chief advisor to both Chandragupta and his successor, these principles are believed to have been the basis of the Mauryan administration, though they presumably represent an ideal like the state in Plato's Republic. There is also some information about the Mauryan government in the Indica of Megasthenes. Chanakya describes a council of ministers chosen by the king for their high birth, honesty, and intelligence, who were supposed to advise him. There were also military and religious officials and 27 heads of departments that were in charge of things like government accounts, forests, and salt deposits, which along with ships, iron mines, and ports were a state monopoly. These departments had staffs of administrative workers called amatyas. On the other hand, the various branches of the army were administered by committees. There was a national court system divided into civil and criminal branches, and local police forces and jails. Punishments were either corporal or monetary, and varied according to the castes of the offender and the victim. In addition to the central administration, the empire was divided into provinces headed by members of the royalty, which in turn were divided into districts run by local officials who were responsible for keeping the peace and surveying the farmlands in their area. Megasthenes, on the other hand, mentions a ban on slavery, the construction of irrigation channels, and officials who were in charge of markets, roads, rivers, and mining. The army had its own bureaucracy, with divisions in charge of soldiers, horses, elephants, and chariots, and officials who tended to the needs of the troops. Megasthenes also mentions local councils in charge of taxes, weights and measures, and manufactured goods. But the accuracy of his description has been questioned, since at least some of what he says is contradicted by our Indian sources. He lists, for example, 7 varnas or castes, even though there were actually 4. The period of Chandragupta's reign was particularly prosperous because his administration developed a system that took shares of agricultural produce, which varied according to the productivity of each parcel of land, and shares of handcrafted goods, as well as collected tolls from roads. This enabled it to plan and carry out public works like irrigation projects. The labor for these projects was done by manual workers, who were required to donate their services to the government for 1 day out of the month. Taxes could be collected in money or in kind, and the government paid its officials with silver coins, which could also be used in private transactions. Some of the land in the empire continued to be owned in common by local communities, as it had been before in some of the Janapadas, while some was owned directly by the state. The empire had a brisk trade with other states in the region, and in particular with the Greek kingdoms and Burma, selling luxury goods like cotton cloth, precious stones, and spices, and also importing gold, horses, and glass. The mainland route through the empire ran between Patna, the capital, and Taxila in the northwest. Chandragupta's son, Bindusara, extended the empire's territory further southward, as we know from a historical epic that was written in Sri Lanka a few centuries later, and from the Buddhist and Jain literature of the time. There were, however, southern kingdoms that he allowed to remain independent. The only region that seems to have resisted Bindusara, or that he chose not to engage, was Kalinga on the East Indian coast, but this was conquered by his son and successor, Ashoka. Unlike his father Chandragupta, Bindusara did not go into seclusion toward the end of his life. He ruled until his death around 274 BCE, and after a few years of contention was succeeded by his son Ashoka. Generally speaking, we have fewer sources of information for Bindusara himself than we do for either his father or his son. Chandragupta was famous for founding an empire, and Ashoka for his military exploits, as well as the life he led afterwards. Before he became king, Ashoka served as commander in his father's army, and after taking the throne, he campaigned in the southern and western parts of the country. Then, about 8 years into his reign, he attacked Kalinga, which was strategically located on the Bay of Bengal, and occupied it. But the fighting that preceded this victory allegedly cost the lives of about 150,000 Kalingans and 100,000 of Ashoka's troops, while many of its inhabitants were turned into forced laborers. According to Buddhist texts of the time, this hardship and loss of life caused Ashoka to completely renounce violence and oppression, and to adopt the Buddhist way of life and the principle of ahimsa, or nonviolence. For the remaining 30 years of his reign, he turned from warfare to ruling according to Buddhist principles, and he spread them throughout India, Sri Lanka, and Central Asia. He also established diplomatic relations with other countries, such as the Hellenistic kingdoms of Asia and Egypt, and sent missionaries to teach them about Buddhism. As part of his reforms, he ended the practice of slavery and forced labor within his empire, and encouraged the ethical treatment of animals. He also set up monuments in places important to the life of the Buddha. But his most famous legacy is the so-called Edicts of Ashoka, which were carved on pillars and rocks throughout India. Though most of these texts were written in Sanskrit, 2 were in Greek, which was spoken in the region of Gandhara, and 1 was in Aramaic, the language of the former Persian Empire. These texts describe Ashoka's conversion to Buddhism and promote the pursuit of Dharma, which one of them describes as having few faults and many good deeds, mercy, charity, faithfulness, and purity. They also call for fairness and mercy in matters of judgment, tolerance towards all religious faiths, and limits on butchering food animals, hunting, and killing wildlife, either deliberately or accidentally. Ashoka died in 232 BCE and was succeeded by his grandsons. They split the empire into eastern and western halves, and it gradually shrank in size as its territories, which had often felt oppressed by the central government, rebelled against it. It may also have been opposed by the country's Brahmin aristocracy, which resented the fact that it had lost its privileges when the royal court turned to Buddhism. At the same time, there was a financial crisis brought about by the government's enormous administrative costs. But it was an act of violence by a Brahmin general named Pushyamitra Shunga that put an end to the rule of the Maurya family in 185 BCE and led to the foundation of the Shunga dynasty. This regime was shorter-lived and governed a much smaller territory than the Mauryas had. It was not for another 500 years that the subcontinent as a whole was, for better or for worse, unified under a single government.
Thanks for watching. Subscribe to my channel for more tutorials. Support me on Patreon so I can keep making content. And as always, feel free to email me, ProfessorDaveExplains@gmail.com.